The man on the bench at Desert View wouldn't look at the flashing lights, wouldn't let anyone touch the radio. He sat barefoot in a torn strip of hide beard to his chest, a spiral burned into the skin above his heart, whispering through cracked lips, as if the words might break him 5 years. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I remember the way mornings used to sound before all this Reno in early spring, the street quiet enough that you could hear the newspaper thump the porch and the little metal chime on the mailbox answer back. I'd pour coffee into a chipped blue mug and check the time twice for no good reason. Kyle would text me something that made me roll my eyes, some joke about chasing the sun before the sun gets ideas. He was 27 then and made the world feel younger than it had any right to be. He shot for a local paper. Nothing glamorous, but he loved light, the way some people love engines or birds. If he had 5 free minutes, he'd drive east out of town just to watch the angle change across dry grass. He and Brandon were a matched set that way. 2 camera bags, 2 tripods, 2 sets of boots that carried dust like a second skin. Brandon worked in real estate photography, knew how to make dull rooms look honest and warm. And out in the wild, he could find a ridge line the way a fisherman feels for current. They didn't need much a sky to measure a map to argue over and a horizon far enough away to call it a plan. The Grand Canyon had been on their list since the first time they camped as teenagers at Pyramid Lake and caught dawn as if it had been staged just for them. They'd said it out loud that morning, standing in air cold enough to bite next time the canyon. Spring 2018, finally lined up with permits and time off and the right stretch of weather. Daytime temps on the rim in the mid-60s to mid-70s, DGF warmer down low winds that could get pushy but manageable if you kept your posture honest. They picked the Hance Creek route, a 12-mile belly of a trail known to chew up confidence, and I remember the printout on our kitchen table like it's still there. Topo lines stacked tight as ribs, the descent traced in red. We did one of those sibling dinners the night before they left town. Kyle showed up with a grocery bag full of dried fruit and those energy bars that taste like punishment, and Brandon brought a little jar of instant coffee because some luxuries are moral obligations. They checked gear, the way pilots do, filters, batteries, backup batteries, SD cards counted out like poker chips, a satellite phone in its hard case the GPS I had bought him after a winter storm scared us both. I made them promise to register with the Rangers and write down every waypoint like they were mailing me breadcrumbs. They agreed, smiling, because they knew I needed to hear it. They rolled out of Las Vegas before first light on April 12th. The desert pitched dark and unreal, the highway a narrow idea under their tires. The way Kyle told it, they stopped for fuel and cheap coffee and joked about who would take the first slip on the steeper switchbacks. By the time they reached the park, the canyon was doing that trick it does no matter how many pictures you've seen your chest hollows when you stand on the rim and realize how far down really is. They checked in at Desert View the afternoon of April 11th. To pick up the week permit, Ranger Maria Solano ran through water sources exit plans, and the way wind carries out there more like a hand than weather. Kyle texted me a photo of their names on the permit line, his thumb intruding into the frame because he never could resist proof. They set up the first camp by water where cottonwoods stitched shade along Hance Creek. Kyle's routine was always the same boil water check lenses load the next day's angles into his head, like coordinates he could walk in his sleep. Brandon liked to talk through shots out loud, pacing off a ledge to feel where the frame would stop. They slept early the first night, woke at 3, and climbed in the kind of dark that makes your breath sound loud. The sunrise they caught Kyle said turned the canyon into a living thing. He always talked about light like it was something that could answer you back. Back home, the days fell into their ordinary shape. I drove to work and spent hours on the phone with people trying to coax a defiant GPS into behaving. A lunchtime walk, a second coffee, a mental note to water the plant I kept forgetting to water. Every few hours I'd check for a message without admitting that was what I was doing. It's a quiet kind of happiness when the world behaves your people doing exactly what they said they would, the weather playing along, nobody late. On April 14th at 8:30 in the morning, my phone buzzed. The satellite message popped up in that blocky font that looks like it belongs to another decade. Everything's fine. Great views. A second line followed. Brandon had pulled a sunset that made him curse and grin at the same time. They planned to explore farther east of camp the next day, scout side canyons for angles most folks don't see. I wrote back a thumbs up and added nothing about how I would check the time even more. Now how I would hold my breath when the wind rose on our street as if it might be the same wind tasting their cheeks miles away. That's the deal we make with the people we love. We keep the panic inside our pockets and show them only the coin of faith. I still see that morning clearly. My townhouse was quiet except for a neighbor's mower starting up and the dryer clicking a button loose. Sun pressed the living room rug into a pattern like a riverbed. I printed their route and pressed it under a magnet on the fridge, a red line down to the Colorado a bend, where Hants Creek should give them water and some shade. A notation about the drop-offs where photographs and poor judgment often meet. I told myself they were ready. They were seasoned. They had the sat phone. And even if the canyon is a place that eats time and humbles pride, it's still just land and light and stone, nothing personal about it. It doesn't go out of its way to take you. You do that part all by yourself. Brandon had a way of treating risk like a tool measured, named, folded back into the pack when he was done. Kyle, for all his bravado, listened to the trail in a way that kept the worst possibilities at the edge of his frame. He would talk about footing as if it were grammar. You don't cut switchbacks. You keep 3 points of contact when the rock turns slick with grit. You respect the places where water has done its slow work. They were not cowboys. They were craftsmen. It mattered to me that people understood that then, and it matters to me now. The last day I saw my brother before they headed east from the main trail, he hugged me in the driveway like he was trying to memorize the size of me. He had grown a beard he didn't quite know what to do with, and it scratched my cheek when he kissed me goodbye. Back in a week, he said, as if weeks were dependable furniture. Brandon honked from the Jeep and waved his coffee like a flag, and there was a sense of choreography to the way they moved, load check, grin, go. I stood there longer than I meant to, with my hand raised, feeling the morning warm my knuckles. People always ask me what kind of brother he was, as if that will help them hold the story. He was the kind who'd fix your sink and leave a note reminding you to change the filter next month with a doodle of a fish. He'd drive out to Pyramid Lake at night to shoot the stars and bring back a lukewarm burrito because he knew I'd be working late. He never missed Mom's birthday, and he could take a joke better than he could deliver one. He kept his promises. That was the bedrock under everything. That afternoon in Reno, a strip of wind moved through, picking up dust and a few early leaves rolling them down the curb like small animals. I noticed because the sky had that high-washed look it gets when there's weather far away. I checked the park forecast out of habit. Gusts could hit 25 to 30 miles an hour on the exposed sections. The bottom would run hotter up into the 80s and 90s DJF, the kind of heat that steals from you slowly. I sent a message I knew wouldn't go through until they had a clear view of the open sky, proud of you. Be smart. It felt like tossing a note into a river and trusting it would find the right bend. The day turned itself down. Evening came with that gold light that makes even ordinary fences look like sculpture. I took a brisk walk, came home, and set the porch light to that soft, warm tone Kyle liked when he visited. I cooked a simple dinner, eggs and toast, because something about big meals felt wrong when the people you love are carrying everything they need on their backs. I washed the pan and let it air dry just to hear the quiet drip. An old radio station played a song our dad used to hum when he fixed the truck, and for a moment I felt the solidity of every year behind us. They had said they might be dark for a day or two while they got deeper into side canyons. That was normal. Canyon walls are generous with beauty and stingy with signal. Still, There are kinds of silence you recognize. The good kind is wide and clean. The other kind has a tension in it like a wire drawn tight over water. You don't see it until the light hits just right, and then you can't pretend it isn't there. I felt the second kind gathering that night and told myself it was nothing more than habit getting ahead of facts. I laid their printed route flat on the kitchen table and weighed the top corner with a salt shaker. The red line curved like a vein into country with names that sound like warnings. If you say them slow, New Hants Red Canyon unnamed, washes that wake up fast after rain. I traced a fingertip along the section where the trail hunkers against the slope and imagined them stopping to scout a frame. Two men setting tripods where the ledge widens, one hand cutting the air to show where the sun will land. I could see the shot in my head shadow pools melting as the Colorado catches fire, a photograph that would ask more of the eye than usual and give more back for the trouble. 9 o'clock came and went. I set my phone face down to muffle the temptation to stare at it. 10 drifted past. I turned the porch light off, then back on, and laughed at myself for the superstition. Near midnight, a gust rattled the front window and rolled a dry leaf down the walk like a small, hurried animal. I told myself to sleep because they would text in the morning and I'd need a clear head. I checked the satellite app one last time and watched the little spinning icon slow to a stop. Some nights end with a decision. That one ended with a sound, the soft click of the lamp as I turned it off, and the house answering with a deeper quiet, the kind that makes you hear your own breathing. I set the phone on the nightstand with the volume high, the porch light still burning a warm circle on the concrete, as if glow could reach across miles of stone and say, "Here, home's right here." By the third night, I'd learned the shape of the silence that followed sunset. It was different now, thicker somehow, like the world was holding its breath. I remember sitting by the window phone on the table, its little red light waiting for a message that never came. Outside, the porch lamp hummed against the glass, and a moth beat itself senseless against the bulb until it finally gave up. That's when I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't fear yet, just a tremor of knowing the kind that starts behind your ribs before it reaches your thoughts. The morning of April 18th started like any other, except that by noon I'd checked my phone a dozen times. There should have been a message by then, some quick line from Kyle saying they'd made it back to the rim, maybe a photo of the Jeep covered in dust. When the clock hit 2 and nothing came, I called the park office, my voice steadier than my hands. The ranger on duty said not to worry. Signal in the canyon could disappear for days at a time. He promised they'd likely appear before nightfall. I thanked him, though my heart didn't believe a word of it. By dark, I called again. That same calm voice told me they'd put a note out to the search and rescue coordinator just in case the hikers were overdue. I sat on the couch after that with the map spread across my knees, tracing the red line down the Hants Creek Trail, then east toward the side canyons Kyle had mentioned. My finger stopped at a bend in the river where the contour lines crowded so close they almost touched terrain steep enough to erase sound. I imagined them somewhere out there huddled in their tent, laughing about my nerves while the wind sang through the rock. I wanted to believe that picture so badly I almost convinced myself it was true. At first light, I called again and reached a woman named Maria Solano. Her tone was calm but alert, the way professionals sound when they're measuring risk. She asked for Kyle's permit number, his satellite phone ID, anything that could narrow the search. I could hear her pen scratching as I read from the paperwork he'd left on my desk. When I told her they'd last texted me on the 14th. She paused for a long moment and said quietly, "We'll start at Hants Creek." Something in her voice, steady, almost reverent, told me she'd seen this kind of silence before. That afternoon, the search began. I drove straight through from Reno to Flagstaff, barely stopping for gas. I remember the way the desert opened up past Kingman, 100 miles of emptiness, rolling out in every direction. The closer I got to the park, the more the land seemed to flatten into memory. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sky had turned the color of raw copper, and the wind carried the metallic smell of rain. A ranger handed me a paper cup of coffee and explained they'd found the campsite down by Hance Creek. Cold ashes, empty cans, a few footprints that led nowhere. The tent and most of their gear were missing. No tracks, no sign of struggle, no note, just absence. The next morning I stood at the rim while the search helicopters swept low along the canyon walls. You don't realize how massive that place is until you watch a helicopter vanish into it, like a toy swallowed by light. The sound fades fast, carried away by the wind that never stops moving down there. A dog team worked the upper switchbacks while rangers on foot traced the trail where the two men had signed in. They found nothing beyond what I'd already been told, just the earth rearranging itself after wind and weather covering what it didn't want found. Detective Robert Campbell arrived that afternoon, a quiet man with a tired kindness about him. He'd worked missing persons longer than anyone in the county. When we shook hands, his eyes stayed on mine a second longer than necessary, as if he wanted me to know the odds before he said a word. He walked me through what they knew the Jeep had been found locked near an overlook a few miles from the official trailhead registration papers inside no keys. The GPS tracker in the dash showed it hadn't moved since the 11th. He asked if Kyle had mentioned changing routes or exploring unofficial paths. I told him about the text. We may be out of contact for a day or two. He nodded, wrote it down, and said, "We'll look beyond the trail." The days that followed moved like wet sand, slow, heavy, shapeless. Volunteers came in from Arizona, Nevada, even Utah. They hiked for hours in heat that pushed into the 90s at the bottom, scanning every crevice, every overhang where a man could take shelter. The wind scraped the cliffs clean of tracks almost as soon as they formed. At night, I stayed in a small park cabin with the curtains open, staring at the dark until my eyes invented shapes. I kept the ranger radio on low, the static filling the silence between search updates. On the 5th night, Campbell stopped by. His boots left a trail of dust across the floor that looked almost deliberate, like proof someone was still moving forward. He told me they'd extended the perimeter to 15 miles using drones and dogs trained for rough terrain. Nothing. He looked down when he said it, then asked if I'd brought something with Kyle's scent for the dogs. I handed over his old hiking gloves. They still smelled faintly of sunblock and leather. As the search stretched into another week, I learned small things about how people handle loss before it's official. Volunteers began leaving little markers at key points, ribbons tied to brush stones, stacked in threes, a language of hope scattered across rock. I followed one team along the rim one morning just far enough to feel what they felt. The air thinned with altitude. My legs ached from the slope. I caught sight of a red bandana wedged between two stones and thought for half a heartbeat it was his. It wasn't. The ranger beside me saw the look on my face and said softly, "The canyon keeps its own time." By April 28th, the official operation shut down. 18 days since the last contact. I signed forms I didn't want to read, each one ending with words like presumed deceased and environmental hazard. The park went back to its routines. The helicopters grounded the trail gates, reopened tourists filing past the same cliffs that had just swallowed 2 men whole. I couldn't make sense of that. I drove to the overlook where they'd parked the Jeep and stood alone at the guardrail. The air was still hot enough to make the rock shimmer. Somewhere below, I thought lay everything that used to make sense, his camera, his boots, his laugh. I whispered his name once just to hear it bounce back, but the canyon kept it. Back home, the house felt wrong. His toothbrush was still in the holder. The mail still came with his name printed neat in the corner of utility bills. I couldn't bring myself to box any of it. Brandon's parents called often in those weeks. Their voices carried the same hollow steadiness I heard in my own. Together, we hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named David Stone, who specialized in missing persons in national parks. He sounded confident on the phone, careful, methodical, the kind of man who trusted maps and patterns more than miracles. He promised to spend a few weeks walking the same ground the Rangers had covered. In May, he sent updates short, factual, without comfort or false hope. He'd interviewed hikers who'd been in the area around the same time. One couple thought they'd seen two men with camera gear near the Hance trailhead, but couldn't swear to it. A ranger on patrol said the trails had been unusually quiet that week. Stone's notes mentioned the weather rain one day, wind strong enough to shift gear the next, and the lack of any fresh trace in the side canyons. Every detail pointed to a simple, brutal explanation: a fall, a slip, a body carried off by water. But even in his reports, there was a small question mark at the end of every paragraph. He couldn't explain the missing equipment or the clean campsite with no torn fabric, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. It's like they walked out of their own footprints, he told me once. Summer came. By June, the families faced what the law required proof of death to settle insurance and estates. It felt grotesque sitting in a courtroom while a judge weighed paperwork against the possibility of survival. The lawyer spoke in terms of dates and durations. No contact for over 60 days, expert testimony on exposure and dehydration, the probability curve that defines the edge of hope. When the ruling came, I didn't cry. I just stared at the official seal and thought about the last text. Everything's fine. Great views. Money arrived months later, sterile and punctual, as if you could invoice grief. I used part of it to set up a small memorial fund for missing hikers, something practical, something he'd have respected. Brandon's parents moved north to Oregon to be closer to family. We all promised to stay in touch, and we did for a while. Birthdays, anniversaries, check-ins that grew shorter with time. Grief doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter, like background static. You stop noticing until it spikes again. The next few years passed in that uneasy quiet. News of other accidents along the Hance Trail reached me now and then: a broken leg, a lost couple, a climber who fell into a crevasse. Each story landed like an echo, proof that the canyon hadn't changed, only the names. I moved to Denver for work in 2021, hoping the distance might soften things. It didn't. Every time I looked at a map, my eyes still found that red scar of a trail winding down to the river. When Mom died, I sorted through old family photos and found one of Kyle on his first camera assignment. He couldn't have been more than 12, squinting into the sun with a disposable Kodak. His smile looked sure certain, like someone who hadn't yet learned how quickly the earth can open beneath you. I framed it and set it on my desk beside a compass he'd given me years before. "So you always know where home is," he'd said. "I used to believe direction could save you. Now I know it only tells you where you were when the world shifted." It was August of 2023 when the phone rang again, a number from Arizona. A ranger's voice, formal but trembling just enough to betray disbelief. "Ms. Marsh, he said, we believe we've found your brother." My first thought was that they'd uncovered remains, maybe a personal item that would finally close the file. But his next words didn't fit any logic I knew. "He's alive," he said. "He walked into the visitor center this morning." I remember gripping the edge of the counter because the floor seemed to tilt. I asked him to repeat it twice just to hear the sound of it forming shape in the air. I didn't cry then either. I didn't move at all. The line between grief and shock is thinner than people think. It feels like the same silence, only this time the air pulls in instead of out. The ranger said he'd send confirmation once they had identification. He said my brother was weak, malnourished, and kept repeating the same sentence. I wrote it down without meaning to, the pen trembling so hard the letters doubled themselves. 5 years. Brandon is dead. That night I packed without thinking, folding clothes into a bag while the porch light hummed like it had that first night. The moths were back, circling the glow. I turned the light off, then on again, the habit too deep to break. As I locked the door, I looked at his photograph on the desk, the boy squinting into sun that now felt like an old memory of warmth. Somewhere out there, he'd walked through 5 years of darkness to find daylight again. And though I didn't yet know what that meant or what had taken him from us, I knew the silence we'd lived with, was about to speak. I landed in Flagstaff the next morning on a flight that felt longer than 5 years. The air hit me sharp and dry as I stepped out of the terminal sunlight too bright for what I was walking toward. A Park Service vehicle waited near the curb, white paint dulled by dust, the ranger inside holding a clipboard like a shield. She introduced herself as Detective Anna Vasquez. Her voice was level steady, the kind people use when they've had to deliver too much truth in too few words. On the drive toward the hospital, she spoke only when necessary dates, times, conditions. When she finally said his name, it was quiet, almost reverent. "He's alive, Miss Marsh, but he's not the same." I didn't ask what that meant. I just watched the desert slide by in muted browns and golds, knowing somewhere in that silence was the canyon that had taken everything from us. When I saw him, I almost didn't recognize him. Kyle had always been lean strong from hauling gear and climbing trails, but the man in that hospital bed looked hollowed out, his skin drawn tight over bones, hair tangled and matted against his shoulders. His eyes, when they opened, darted like an animal testing light. I called his name softly, but it took him a moment to find my face. He didn't cry. He just stared, mouth trembling, and whispered, "I thought I'd never see you again." His hand shook when I took it, cold and frail as paper, but his grip was still there, the same reflex from when he used to help me climb fences as kids. For a long while we didn't speak. We just sat in that fluorescent quiet while the machines marked each shallow breath. Over the next day, I learned what little the doctors knew. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, scarred in ways that told stories no one wanted to imagine. His chest bore a crude spiral burned into the skin, and his back carried a constellation of healed cuts and burns. The psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Thompson, said he was suffering from complex trauma, his memory, fragmentary, time disjointed. Sometimes he thought it was still 2018. Sometimes he didn't know where he was at all. When she asked him what happened, he told her pieces, fragments that came out in broken order, the caves, the men fire. Words that sat heavy in the room like stones. 2 days later, they brought in Brandon's father. Robert Lowry was a quiet man with a farmer's posture, straight back, hands folded like he was bracing for judgment. When he saw Kyle, his expression flickered between relief and something darker. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He went straight to the question that had waited half a decade to be asked. "Where's my son?" Kyle looked down, eyes wide and distant as if searching memory for permission. His voice came out cracked but certain. They burned him. The silence that followed was bottomless. Robert's breath caught once. Then he stood and walked out of the room. I didn't see him again that day. That night I sat beside my brother's bed listening to the machines hum and the wind rattle the blinds. When I finally asked him what he meant, he turned his head toward the wall and whispered, "You don't want to know." But I did. I had to. He slept in short, restless bursts, muttering names and sounds that didn't belong in any language I knew. Once near dawn, I heard him repeat a phrase, something about the weeping snake. It didn't sound like madness. It sounded like belief. Detective Vasquez arranged a formal interview the following afternoon. She said it was voluntary, but I could tell from her tone it was also necessary. The county needed a record, dates, names, any details that could be verified. The room they used was small and windowless, a recorder set in the center of the table. I sat behind him as they began not to speak, but to anchor him somehow like a tether back to the world he'd left. His lawyer, Kevin Bruner, the same man who'd handled the insurance years ago, sat beside him, quiet but attentive. The story came out in uneven waves like someone remembering through fog. He said on April 14th he and Brandon had left the main trail to photograph a rock formation east of their camp. He remembered hearing a scream, then running his voice cracked when he described it and finding Brandon surrounded by men covered in animal hides and paint. He said their faces were marked with symbols, their hair woven with bones. He tried to run but was caught tied, gagged, and marched through a narrow crevice hidden by brush. It took them hours, he said, to reach the caves. You couldn't see it unless you knew where to look, he murmured. The rock folds in on itself, like it wants to hide them. He spoke of torchlight, the smell of smoke, and something rotten. The chambers inside twisted deep into the rock, connected by tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. He described an altar of flat stone covered in bones and symbols. Men who spoke little but made sounds like bird calls to each other. There were women, too, he said, but fewer faces, hidden movements, ritualistic. He didn't know how many there were in total, maybe a dozen, maybe more. Their leader, he said, was an old man with scars across his chest and arms called only the Blood. The others obeyed him without question. As Kyle spoke, his hands trembled on the table. He described daily rituals, cuts on the hand's blood collected in bowls, chants that rose and fell like breathing. He said he and Brandon were kept in a side chamber blocked by a stone slab. They were fed once a day, boiled meat roots water that tasted like copper. When Vasquez asked what kind of meat he swallowed hard and shook his head. I stopped asking, he said. His eyes flicked up not to her but to me, and in that glance I saw the same boy who used to hide behind me during thunderstorms. I had no words to give him now. 2 weeks into their captivity, he said, Brandon tried to escape. There had been a ritual that night, smoke-drumming distraction. Brandon slipped away when the guard's attention faltered. He made it as far as the canyon wall before they caught him. Kyle's voice dropped low when he told what came next. They made me watch, he said. They said it was the way to purify the trespass. He stopped there, shaking his head, and for a long time no one in that room spoke. The hum of the recorder filled the air like a second heartbeat. After the interview, Vasquez pulled me aside. She said they would have to verify everything, that a full team would be heading into the canyon based on his directions. It's possible, she said carefully, that his trauma could have distorted memory. But her eyes told me she wasn't sure it had. She'd seen enough cases to know when truth and delusion blur together, and this wasn't the same. She looked tired, like someone who'd glimpsed a piece of the desert that most people never should. When the investigation team left for the canyon a few days later, I stayed in Flagstaff. I couldn't bring myself to go near that place again. They used Kyle's rough map sketches of tunnels, landmarks, a dry wash that led to the cave mouth hidden behind stone and branches. It took them nearly a week, slowed by rain and the shifting terrain. On the 7th day, Vasquez called me herself. I could tell from her breathing before she spoke that they'd found something. We located the site, she said. There's evidence of habitation recent, maybe within months. She hesitated, then added, and bones. They confirmed later that some remains matched Brandon's age and build. DNA testing would take time, but I didn't need the lab report. Kyle already knew. When I told him, he nodded once, eyes unfocused, then whispered, he didn't deserve that. None of us did. He fell silent for a long while after that, staring out the hospital window at the line of pines swaying in the wind. The next week blurred into interviews, reports, media requests. I refused. The FBI got involved, bringing anthropologists from Northern Arizona University to study the site. They found more than anyone expected: fire pits tools, fragments of animal hide, clothing drawings etched into stone walls. Some of the paintings were old, ancient even, but others were fresh, still tinted with ochre that hadn't yet faded. The symbols matched those Kyle described. No living members of the group were found. The caves were empty, but not abandoned fire ashes, cold scraps of food left as if the occupants had vanished overnight. When the official report came in, it stopped short of naming the group. Unidentified individuals living in isolation within the park, it said. But privately, Vasquez told me they believed it was a long-standing cult, generations deep, hidden in the folds of the canyon for decades, maybe longer. They called themselves descendants of the Weeping Snake, a name whispered in a few old ranger reports about strange symbols found near remote trails. Nothing had ever been proven. Until now. The following months were a haze of rehabilitation. Kyle was moved to a clinic in Phoenix, where he started therapy to piece himself back together. He didn't talk much about the caves anymore, at least not to me. When he did, his words came slow, careful, as if saying too much might call something back. He had nightmares almost every night. Once, when I visited, I found him sitting outside his room before dawn, staring at the light creeping across the floor. "You ever notice," he said softly, "how quiet sunlight is? You'd think it'd make noise after all that dark." There were moments when I wondered if any of it was real. It's easier sometimes to believe madness than to face the idea that such a thing could live unseen inside our world. But then the lab results came back, DNA confirmation of Brandon's remains, traces of human blood on the stone altar footprints, matching multiple individuals. The evidence said enough. The canyon had held a secret, and my brother had been its prisoner. The case stayed open for months, but never led to arrests. Whoever those people were, they were gone before daylight reached their caves again. The park sealed off the area, citing safety and ongoing research. I stopped asking for updates after a while. Some truths are too heavy to carry any further. Now, when I think of that stretch of the canyon, I don't see beauty anymore. I see the light fading over stone the way it must have looked that last evening before they vanished, two friends chasing a sunset they'd never catch. And somewhere in that silence, I imagine the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the dark, a door of rock closing behind them, and the desert keeping its promise to never tell all its stories at once. For months after the investigation, I tried to keep some rhythm to life. I'd drive to the rehab center each morning and sit with Kyle while the light came through those narrow hospital windows, painting everything in that faint yellow haze that never quite warmed the air. He was thinner than before, but stronger than when he'd first arrived. His skin had started to heal, though the spiral burned into his chest would always stay. He didn't talk much at first, not about the caves or the people in them, but about small things. What the rain smelled like the night he escaped, how his feet bled when he climbed, how the sky looked wrong after so many years underground. I'd listen and nod, letting him set the pace. Some memories were too heavy to pull up all at once. Sometimes the doctors would ask me to leave during his therapy sessions, and I'd wander the hospital corridors just to feel air that wasn't thick with disinfectant. There was one hallway lined with old photos of the Grand Canyon sepia prints from the early 1900s, back when explorers still mapped those ridges with hand-drawn charts. I'd find myself staring at those pictures, tracing the same cliffs where my brother had been lost, thinking about how a place that big could still hide people who'd chosen to live beyond time. It unsettled me, but there was also something about it I couldn't stop thinking about. We go to the canyon to feel small, and maybe that smallness is what drew them there too. People who needed to disappear or to build a world that obeyed their own laws. Whatever their reasons, they had taken everything from him and from Brandon's family too. In early November, a team from the FBI and the National Park Service gave me permission to review some of their findings. I wasn't sure I wanted to, but I couldn't not know. They showed me photos from inside the caves, the soot-dark walls, the stone tools, animal hides strung from pegs carved into the rock. There were bones, both human and animal, laid out in deliberate patterns. I remember one photograph that stopped me cold, a flat stone altar in the center of a chamber marked with spirals painted in black and red, the pigments still sharp after all that time. Around it were small bundles of feathers and bits of metal shaped like charms. It was exactly as Kyle had described. For years I had wondered if his mind had fractured under trauma, if his memories had twisted themselves into something unrecognizable. But standing in that office staring at those photographs, I knew he had told the truth. Every word. The investigators called them the descendants of the weeping snake. No one could trace the name beyond speculation. Anthropologists suggested a link to an old tribal legend, though nothing in the artifacts matched known native symbology. The timeline made less sense the deeper they went. Radiocarbon testing showed that some items in the caves were over 100 years old, scraps of woven cloth, rusted tools, while others were new enough to still carry the scent of smoke. It meant generations had come and gone down there, surviving in isolation, passing on rituals older than their own names. But there was no sign of where they'd gone after Kyle's escape. The ashes were cold. The paths were clean. It was as if the canyon itself had swallowed them back. I brought the file to Kyle one afternoon, hoping it might give him closure. He flipped through the pages in silence, eyes scanning every photograph with slow precision. When he came to the altar, his hand paused mid-air. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's where they made me stand." His voice broke halfway through the sentence. I reached for his hand, but he pulled it back, shaking his head. "You don't know what that place smells like," he whispered. "It gets into you. You can't wash it out." Then, for the first time since he'd come home, he started to cry. Not loud, not shaking, just tears tracing down his cheeks while the rest of him stayed completely still. I'd seen him angry before, broken before, but that was something else. It was grief without end. That night I sat by his bed until he fell asleep. The machines hummed softly beside him, steady as a heartbeat. I looked at the tattoo burned into his chest, the rough spiral still dark against his skin, and wondered what it meant to the people who put it there. Maybe it was a mark of ownership, maybe of survival. Either way, it was a language I'd never learned to read. He shifted in his sleep, muttering words I didn't recognize, the same low sounds he made when nightmares came. I wanted to wake him, but Dr. Thompson had warned me not to said dreams were how the mind reorganized pain. So I sat and waited for morning, listening to him breathe. By December, he was walking on his own, still thin but steadier. He'd begun group therapy with other survivors of captivity. It helped him realize that trauma has a pattern, that memory isn't linear. He could talk now about the day he escaped the rain that softened the stone, the ceiling that cracked just enough to let him through. He said the air outside felt too sharp, too full, like breathing for the first time in years. He followed a dry creek bed for days, sleeping in shallow depressions, surviving on rainwater and roots. When he described reaching the lookout, his voice changed. "It was so quiet," he said. "I thought I was dead until I saw a car parked up on the ridge. That's when I knew I'd really made it out." For Christmas, he asked for something simple, a camera. Not to take landscapes, he said, but to remember faces. Light doesn't lie, he told me one morning, adjusting the strap around his neck. He wasn't ready for people yet, not really, but he took photographs of the small things, the way sunlight hit the curtains, the birds that landed on the clinic's railing, the pale blue of early dusk that reminded him of the canyon sky. It was his way of reclaiming what they'd stolen. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at a shot for minutes at a time, lost somewhere between then and now. In March of the following year, the investigation officially closed. The report concluded that Kyle and Brandon had been abducted by an unidentified group of individuals living illegally within Grand Canyon National Park. Brandon's death was ruled a homicide. The perpetrators were listed as unknown. It felt so clean on paper, so clinical, but nothing about it was clean. When the case files were handed to me, I noticed the final note in Detective Vasquez's handwriting. It said, "Evidence supports subject's testimony. Group no longer present. Recommend closure for safety reasons." Closure. Such a strange word for something that never really closes. A few weeks later, Kyle was released from the clinic and moved in with me in Denver. The first night home, he couldn't sleep in a room without windows. We ended up dragging a mattress into the living room so he could lie where the moonlight reached. He said he needed to see the sky to believe he was still free. Over time, he built small routines, morning walks, slow breakfasts, short drives around the city. Crowds made him nervous, loud noises worse. But in quiet spaces, he started to come back to himself. I could see flickers of the brother I'd grown up with in the way he adjusted his camera settings or smiled when the light hit just right. We kept in touch with Detective Vasquez. She visited once that summer to check on him, and I remember her standing on our porch looking out toward the mountains. Places like that canyon, she said, they don't give up their ghosts easy. She told us the park had closed the Hants Creek Trail indefinitely while they conducted geological studies of nearby caves. Unofficially, she said they'd doubled the ranger patrols and added surveillance to remote trails. It's not about tourists anymore, she admitted. It's about what might still be out there. That night after she left, Kyle sat out on the porch long after dark. I brought him a blanket, but he barely moved. "You think they're still down there?" I asked. He didn't answer at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If they are, they're not what they used to be. They lost their faith when I escaped. You can't worship in the dark forever." He paused, eyes distant. "But maybe that's what the canyon wants to keep them, to keep anyone who forgets to look up." I didn't sleep much that night. The wind outside had that low, restless sound that always makes me think of the canyon, an endless hush, neither threat nor comfort, just presence. I found myself wondering how many people had walked those trails over the years, how many had vanished without leaving so much as a footprint. The thought wasn't superstition. It was geography. There are places in this world too deep for sunlight to touch, and the people who go looking for what hides there sometimes don't come back. My brother had. Somehow. But part of him was still down there, sealed inside stone and silence. In the morning, I found him asleep on the couch with the camera resting on his chest. Through the window, the first light was breaking a soft gold that spread across his face, washing away the night's shadows. For a moment, he looked peaceful. Whole. I stood there watching, not wanting to disturb him, not daring to believe that peace would last. The world had given him back to me, but I knew it hadn't finished telling its story yet. And somewhere far away in the folds of that endless canyon, the wind was still moving through the empty caves, carrying voices no one alive could understand. I still remember the first morning that felt ordinary again, or close enough to pretend. It was spring a little over a year after Kyle came home. I woke to sunlight spilling through the blinds, the smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen, and for a moment I thought time had folded back on itself. But when I walked out and saw him sitting by the window, camera in hand, tracing the horizon with tired eyes, I knew the world had changed for good. He didn't speak much anymore, not unless the day called for it. Some mornings he'd take the Jeep out toward the foothills, chasing whatever light the sky offered. Other days he just sat quietly listening to the wind. It was strange how peace could look so much like survival. He was alive, yes, but alive in the way a tree still stands after lightning splits it down the middle. Whole enough to fool you, hollowed where you can't see. He moved through days, gently careful not to break anything else. I learned to follow his rhythm. Slow walks, small meals, long silences. The doctor said he was making progress. I didn't argue. I'd seen the scars, both kinds, and I knew progress wasn't the same as healing. The investigators stayed in touch for a while. Detective Vasquez called every few months with updates that always sounded the same. The case was closed. The caves sealed the trail, still off limits. The official record said unidentified offenders presumed relocated. But none of us really believed that. I think Vasquez knew it too. There was a weariness in her voice the last time we spoke, a quiet admission that some mysteries don't want to be solved. She'd transferred out of Flagstaff by then, took a desk job in Phoenix. I still think about him, she told me, about what he walked through. Some nights I wonder what else might still be walking out there. Brandon's father wrote once a short letter in a steady, deliberate hand. He said he'd buried a small box near the Oregon coast, a place his son had loved when he was younger. Inside were photos, a compass, and a handful of sand from the canyon. He invited us to visit someday, but said he understood if we couldn't. I never went. Maybe because I was afraid of what it would feel like to stand at another edge looking out over another impossible distance. By winter, Kyle had started talking again about returning to the canyon. Not to the same place, just to see it to prove to himself it still existed beyond memory. I didn't say no, though every part of me wanted to. We drove down in February, the roads slick with meltwater, the sky that washed-out blue that makes the cliffs look sharper. When we reached the overlook at Desert View, he got out first and walked straight to the railing. I stayed back, watching him stand there against the wind. From behind, he looked almost like the man I'd lost, the same posture, the same shoulders, only slower somehow, as if he carried something unseen. He didn't stay long. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. When he turned around, his eyes were wet but steady. "It's still there," he said. "The river, the cliffs, all of it. But it doesn't have me anymore." He smiled, then small and tired, and it was the closest thing to peace I'd seen on his face since he'd come home. We drove back in silence, stopping in a little diner just outside the park. The waitress recognized him. His story had been all over the news that summer, and I saw the way her expression softened when she realized who he was. She didn't ask questions, just refilled our coffee and slipped a slice of pie onto the table on the house. It was such a small kindness, but it meant more than she could have known. People forget how healing simple recognition can be, that moment when someone sees your pain and doesn't look away. That night, as we crossed back into Colorado, the desert faded behind us. I asked him what he'd tell people if anyone ever asked what really happened down there. He looked out the window for a long time before answering. "I'd tell them it's not the darkness that gets you," he said. "It's how quiet it is. You start to think maybe the world's forgotten you, and then one day you realize it hasn't. That's when it hurts." I didn't respond. There wasn't anything to add. I just kept my eyes on the road, letting his words settle like dust. In the years since, life has found a way to keep moving. I still work for the GPS company, though I've shifted toward research, helping design trackers that can survive extreme conditions. Every time a hiker's location pings back from some forgotten canyon or ridge, I think about him. About how one signal, one line of coordinates can mean the difference between gone and found. Maybe that's why I stayed in this line of work. Some people look for closure. I look for connection. Kyle still takes photographs. He doesn't share them online or sell them anywhere. He just prints them, pins them to the wall, and replaces them when the light changes. Most are landscapes, but every so often he'll take one that surprises me, an empty chair on our porch, a street at dawn, my reflection in a rain-spotted window. He calls those the proof shots. Proof that he's here, that we both are. Sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night and steps outside without a word. I'll follow him just far enough to see him standing barefoot on the deck looking up at the stars. He says the night sky reminds him of the ceiling in the caves, the places where cracks let light through. He told me once that when you've lived that long without sunlight, even the smallest glimmer feels holy. I didn't understand then, but I think I do now. The park eventually reopened the Hance Creek Trail under strict permit, though parts near the caves remain sealed. Hikers still go missing out there from time to time, though most are found heat stroke, dehydration, bad footing. Normal tragedies, if such a thing exists. The Grand Canyon has a way of reminding people how fragile we really are. Every few months I see a story online about another rescue, another near miss, and I think about how easily Kyle could have been another statistic instead of a survivor. As for me, I still keep his first camera in a drawer by the bed. It's dented, the lens cracked, the metal worn smooth from years of use. Sometimes I'll pick it up just to feel the weight of it. It's strange how heavy memory can be when it takes a shape you can hold. The last photo he ever took before disappearing was on that camera, a wide shot of the canyon at sunset, the edges glowing like they were on fire. I had it restored and framed. It hangs above our mantel now. When the light hits it in the late afternoon, the colors almost move like the moment never really ended. I still get messages sometimes from strangers who followed the story, people who've lost someone to wilderness or time. They tell me my brother's survival gave them hope, that it reminded them not every mystery ends in bones and silence. I never know what to say back. Hope feels too complicated now, too costly. But I tell them the truth. Survival is not the same as return. It's a beginning that never stops asking what came before. The last time Kyle and I talked about Brandon, he said he still dreams of him sometimes. Not the night of the fire, but before, on the trail, laughing about the weight of their packs, talking about the light. He's always just ahead of me, Kyle said, eyes fixed on the horizon. He turns back, smiles, and I wake up. Maybe that's mercy, I don't know. Maybe it's the canyon letting him keep one good memory untouched. People ask how you move on from something like this, but the truth is you don't. You move with it. It becomes part of the landscape, quiet but constant, shaping every new day like water-shaped stone. Time smooths the edges, but the shape stays. Some nights when the house is still, I'll hear the faint hum of the wind through the trees and think of how that same wind once swept through caves carved into the canyon walls. It's all connected somehow. Air memory, the things we can't see but still feel. If there's anything this story taught me, it's that the earth keeps its secrets better than we keep ours. But even in its silence, it gives back what it takes in its own time. My brother is proof of that. He came back changed, but he came back. And sometimes that has to be enough. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering is its own kind of light, and in some places it's the only one left.